Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to look at the Google Classroom, maybe start some of your journals. If you have any questions, you can always get a hold of me either on Remind, through Zoom office hours, or through my email. But let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so to kind of get us back into the Cold War, I have this quote from Stalin. And Stalin's over here saying, "This war is not as in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. It cannot be otherwise." And so Stalin's really explaining how in the Cold War, it's not just about taking over territory for resources, it's about really imposing somebody's ideology on somewhere else. So, for example, we're going to see the Soviet Union try and expand communism to impose communism on others. At the same time, we're going to see the United States try and do the same thing with what they're going to call a democracy. And it's not just about those resources. Like, again, it's about spreading that ideology. All right, to kind of bring us back to what we were talking about the last time, it's just a reminder that the United States and the Soviet Union had been allies in World War II. Allies of convenience. They weren't necessarily friends, but they were working together to fight the Axis powers. And you're going to see some resentment grow, particularly on the side of the Soviet Union. If you will remember, the Soviet Union was working really hard to defeat the Nazis. If you remember, the Nazis had invaded Russia, and we were talking about millions and millions of Russians dying fighting the Nazis. So when the United States entered the war, Russia really wanted them to enter in Europe to help Russia out at that moment. But the United States actually enters in North Africa. And the Soviet Union is going to harbor some resentment for that we didn't help them right away, and that's going to cost lots of lives. However, at the same time that some of that's going on, we're going to see that there are Russian spies in the United States trying to steal atomic weapons, and they're successful. They're very successful, particularly in World War II, and then in the early days of the Cold War, of kind of stealing nuclear scientists' information, which is going to help Russia quite a bit. Okay, so we kind of have these moments of resentment and tension even before the war is over that are going to continue to build and build during the Cold War. All right, so after World War II, as we're getting into the beginning stages of the Cold War, we're going to see that Russia, the Soviet Union, and the United States are the two superpowers that are left from the war. They are going to be fighting for essentially world domination. They're the only ones that have enough resources or the ability to kind of come out of World War II swinging. If we think about some of our world powers that were in World War II, so France or Great Britain or Germany, they're in ruins. They don't have the ability to be that superpower. And so Russia and the United States are going to kind of take advantage of that situation. Okay? So they're fighting for what they call a sphere of influence. How much of the world can they get kind of under their influence or their power? And both of them are trying to expand that, and they're trying to serve their own interests. Russia thinks that expanding communism around the world is going to benefit them. And we, as America, think that by spreading democracy, that too will benefit us. All right, we're going to talk about that. Technically, the Cold War ends in the early 90s. And that changes what our foreign policy is going to be. But if we actually look at where we are as a world today, we might actually think about being in the Cold War 2.0. So we might talk about the United States will ultimately win the first Cold War. But if we think about now, we still kind of see some tension, lots of tension between Russia and the United States. And Russia's doing a pretty good job of meddling in America, as well as other democracies around the world. If you go back to the 2016 election, you hopefully are aware that Russia was definitely meddling in that, and they were spreading disinformation. So this is kind of the 21st century way of sort of that spying and that meddling that we see in the Cold War. And it's not just the United States that is experiencing that. Lots of European countries have also had to deal with disinformation campaigns from Russia. So I want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we kind of move forward. And there's a link right here to an article, and I can also send you all sorts of other things if you're interested in what that might look like today. All right. So at the end of my last video, I asked you guys to watch Crash Course. I'm hoping you did that, but there are a couple things that I wanted to point out. So even if you didn't watch it, I'll kind of go through some of them with you. So one of the questions that the video looks at is, why do we call this a Cold War? And the silly way that John Green explains that is it never heats up. We don't have actual war between the United States and the Soviet Union. You'll have proxy wars or little wars, like the Vietnam War or Korea, where they're choosing sides, where the US is going to back one part and Russia, the Soviet Union, is going to back another. But they're never actually fighting each other. So we don't have this massive world war against these two world powers. The other thing that the video talks about, and I think is important for this unit, is that of like, what is the question? What are Americans thinking about? And he describes it as, when will I blow up? That is the question of the era. And I think that really explains why we might think of some of these things as ridiculous in 2020, but at this moment, they're deathly afraid of these things. They're terribly afraid of a nuclear war. And when is that going to happen? So I want you to think about, and this is probably pretty close to home for some of us, if you are living in an era of fear, or you are afraid about what will happen to your friends or your family or your community, what is that going to do to how you look at the world, or how you move about the world, or what you expect from your government? All right, then what are some of the goals of containment? Containment I'll actually show you in a different slide, but it's essentially the idea of trying to contain the Soviet Union, or trying to contain communism. So it can stay where it's at, but it's not allowed to expand. So under that kind of blanket policy, we're going to see that the United States is going to try and block Soviet expansion, so SU, Soviet Union, expose Soviet falsities, so lies. So what is it that they're lying about? Why are they trying to say that communism is this good thing, but we think it's absolutely a bad thing, and they're lying about that? Okay. Reduce Soviet control and influence over the world, and foster the destruction of the Soviet Union. So not only contain communism where it is, but the Soviet Union stops being a thing. That sounds pretty good to us. All right, so kind of under that, the United States is going to see this as a fight. This is an era of fight about like essentially how different we are from Russia and the Soviet Union. So in the United States' eyes, this is a fight between freedom and tyranny. America is a symbol of freedom, whereas the Soviet Union is tyranny. The West, where the United States is, and the East, the Soviet Union. Capitalist freedom and communism totalitarianism. So again, you're kind of seeing this repeated thing about, in the United States, we have these freedoms and these liberties, but under communism, you have totalitarianism and complete control. And that is totally against what we want. And we don't want that for ourselves or for the world. So kind of along that vein, you're going to see that there's actually no major difference, at least in the beginning, between the political parties. Both Republicans and Democrats, leaders and Americans are so deathly afraid of communism that you see they're pretty much in agreement on how that's our number one enemy. They're definitely going to disagree sometimes about like how you fight that enemy, but overall agreement that communism is the enemy and the Soviet Union is the enemy. Okay? So I always find one of the interesting things that comes out with that is that we add under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. And the reason that we add that in the 50s is there's this assumption that all communists are atheists. And so in order to kind of fight back against that or to resist communism, we're going to add this part about under God. But for many people at that time, but also throughout history, as we've continued to keep that in our Pledge of Allegiance, have questions. Because if you were saying in our pledge, under God, but our First Amendment rights tell us that we have the freedom of religion, then how do those things square up? Because we don't all either believe in a religion or a God, or maybe we don't believe in a singular God. So there seems to be some sort of discrepancy between what we're doing and what maybe some of our freedoms or our rights are supposed to be in the United States. So an interesting thing that is happening as we are trying to fight communism. All right, and the last major thing that I want to make sure that we understand from that video, again, I hope you took the time to watch it, is what is the government's role? What is the United States' role at this moment? And what we've seen the role of the government to be, or what the priorities of the government should be, have changed over time. But really, we're going to see at this moment that people feel that the role of the government is to keep us safe, to keep us from destruction, to keep us, if we think about the big question of the era, to keep us from blowing up. And this gets to be some interesting things, because that means that we got to prioritize things. And one of the ways to think about this is our values. So freedom versus security. So are we willing to give up some of that freedom if that means that we are going to be secure or safe? Are we willing to give up maybe some of our First Amendment rights to protect our lives, or vice versa? So we see this in an interesting way at this moment. On one hand, we want the government to keep us safe. So we actually see things like the creation of the highway system, the idea that we could use those to escape in any sort of nuclear disaster or imminent nuclear threat, which I always think is funny. If you spent any time on 99, the idea that we're all going to escape by driving on 99 is kind of ridiculous. We're not going anywhere on 99. But on the other hand, what we're going to see, particularly as we get into the Red Scare, or this kind of domestic fear of communism, is there are going to be some restrictions on our right to criticize the government, or some backlash if you are criticizing the government. So that freedom to criticize or to speech that we see in our First Amendment is going to be curtailed or limited. And how does that really square with what our rights are, or what we think the government's role is? All right. So I mentioned in the last lecture that the Cold War, the stage for the Cold War is really being set at the end of World War II. But pretty dang quick after that war is done, we're going to really see that the Cold War is solidified. The fact that this is going to be the international question is going to solidify. And we actually see that kind of start in the speech that Winston Churchill gives. And remember, he had been the Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. And in this speech he's actually giving in the United States, he's going to talk about this iron curtain that is going to divide Europe. And you can see that right here. And this is not a literal curtain. There's not really a piece of iron that is like dividing this, but that you see kind of the sphere of influence in Europe solidifying. So in the green in this, you're going to see this is the Soviet sphere essentially, and the West is really going to be the US's sphere of influence, where they're kind of influencing things. So communism, essentially non-communism, or the likelihood that they will become communistic. All right. And we're going to see more of that through containment and the Truman Doctrine. So Truman, obviously president, and he's going to come up with this idea. Well, he doesn't come up with the idea of containment, but that's going to be his doctrine or his foreign policy. And again, containment is the idea that we want to stop the spread of communism. It's okay wherever it is right now, but we don't want to see it expand. Essentially, we're going to keep it put in a container, we're going to close that lid, and we're not going to let it go anywhere. It's stuck there. So under his Truman Doctrine, which is containment, though, his way of fighting that or containing that is by giving financial resources to places that are trying to resist communism. So one of the first places that we see that is actually in Turkey and Greece. And so we're going to give money to Turkey and Greece to try and get them to resist communism. But the best example of that is going to be the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan, they kind of call it a New Deal for Europe. So much like FDR provided, or FDR and Congress provided a bunch of resources for Americans during the Great Depression so that they could weather that storm, that financial crisis, we're going to do something very similar for Europe. So all these places that have been destroyed by World War II that are really suffering, lots and lots of economic hardships on individuals, but also rebuilding after the war. So in order to help them and also keep them away from the ideas of communism, we're going to come up with the Marshall Plan. We're going to provide these billions and billions of dollars, something like $20 billion for Europe. And this is pretty dang smart. We're going to kind of show them that capitalism is the way and can kind of help these countries rebuild. Also, they're buying a lot of goods from the United States. So not only are we helping these countries, keeping them kind of loyal to the United States, we're also helping the American economy. Interesting enough, we also offer aid to Russia, but we put a lot of strings on it that we know Russia won't take advantage of, or the Soviet Union won't take advantage of. And so this is a way for America to be like, well, we offered, you just didn't take our aid. All right, so sometimes I come up with silly things to help me remember what's happening. So the way I kind of think of containment, so this overarching thing of containing communism where it is, not allowing it to expand. Okay, so that's going to be our umbrella. It's our most broad category. Okay, you can see my silly Rihanna connection up there. Okay, all right, so that's the number one. Under that, a little bit more specific, is the Truman Doctrine. And again, Truman Doctrine is about giving financial resources to whoever needs it in order to steer clear from communism or resist communism. Okay, so that's the Truman Doctrine. We're going to give people money or resources. Under the Truman Doctrine, the most specific example of that is the Marshall Plan. And this is because we're specifically giving money to these European countries. Okay, so containment, stop communism from growing. Truman Doctrine, give places money or resources to stop communism. And then the Marshall Plan, very specific, Europe is getting money. Okay, so an example, Truman does not want to see communism grow in Guatemala. So he's going to give Guatemala money or resources. And so that would be an example of the Truman Doctrine. Okay, not the Marshall Plan, because Guatemala is not in Europe. All right. An early crisis that we're gonna see is over the division of Germany and Berlin. So post-World War II, they're going to divide Germany into 4 parts. So essentially, Russia's going to get a sector, and then the rest of the Allies are going to split the other parts. So you have a US zone, French zone, British zone. Okay, they're going to do the same thing with Berlin, because Berlin is the capital. That's where all the decisions are going to be made. So even though the capital is in the Russian zone, the Allies want a piece of that. So they're going to divide Berlin. And so you're going to get an East Berlin and a West Berlin. And West Berlin is split up in these 3 zones, essentially. These 3 zones, just like West Germany is as well. Okay. However, that's going to be one of the first confrontations between the Soviet sphere and the US sphere. And that's because we're going to see a Soviet blockade. So this part right here is essentially surrounded by the Russian zone. And so they're going to cut off access. So this part right here can't get any resources. And so the Allies are going to actually have to fly in supplies for almost a year, okay, until we can get the Soviet Union and Stalin to stop this blockade. Okay, so this is prior to the Berlin Wall, but this is just one of the very initial standoffs between these 2 powers. And that's going to lead to the creation of NATO. Okay, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So essentially, all these Western countries that are in the US sphere are going to kind of team up together. They're going to be this new alliance against the Soviet sphere. And it officially comes later, but we're going to see that this is going to be in opposition. So NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. Okay, so those 2 sides. All right. Again, you guys know I love documents, but I can only do so many with you. So we're just going to look at this single one because I think this is a pretty cool one. And kind of shows you kind of the, what do I want to call this? The tension between the US sphere and the Soviet sphere. I also just think this one is kind of funny. So this is Henry Wallace. And if we come down here, it says he was the Secretary of Commerce and the former Vice President. And he is writing to President Harry Truman. This is July 1946. And it says Truman, this should say asked, even though you can't see it, Wallace to resign shortly after this letter. All right, so I'm going to ask myself a couple of questions. First of all right, Wallace has to resign after he does this letter. So that tells me that whatever he writes to Truman is probably not going to make Truman very happy if he's going to have to resign after this. And the other thing I'm looking at, vice president. I wonder whose vice president he was. Interesting enough, he was actually FDR's vice president. Had been FDR's vice president, and he gets kicked off the ticket the very last time that FDR runs for president and is replaced by Truman. So Truman becomes the VP the very last time that FDR runs. And so what that means is that Henry Wallace was just months away from becoming president of the United States because FDR died in that last term. So Henry Wallace, I can imagine, is not terribly happy about the fact that Truman, and not himself, has become president. The other thing is Henry Wallace gets kicked off the ticket because he's seen as more liberal or progressive, and FDR is worried about losing moderate support. And so we might also think about what a different world we live in because we get a Harry Truman president versus a Henry Wallace president. And that's not a dig at Truman or Wallace, just that these two men have very different outlooks on the world, and things would be different if we'd gotten Wallace instead of Truman. All right, but what does Wallace say to Truman? So the very early stages of the Cold War. And Henry Wallace says, I have been increasingly disturbed about the trend of international affairs since the end of the war. How do American actions appear to other nations? I mean, actions like the Bikini test of the atomic bomb and the continued production of bombs, the plan to arm Latin America with our weapons, and the effort to secure air bases spread over half the globe from which the other half of the globe can be bombed. I cannot but feel that these actions must make it look to the rest of the world as if we were only paying lip service to peace at the conference table. These facts rather make it appear either one, that we are preparing ourselves to win the war, which we regard as inevitable, or that we are trying to build a predominance of force to intimidate the rest of mankind. Our interest in establishing democracy in Eastern Europe, where democracy by and large has never existed, seems to the Soviets an attempt to reestablish the encirclement of unfriendly neighbors, which might serve as a springboard of still another effort to destroy them. So Henry Wallace is saying, whoa, Truman, what you're doing really makes it look like America is being aggressive. Not that we're being this like savior or we're helping all these places fight back against democracy, but this is an aggressive stance that the United States is taking to kind of dominate the world and to kind of intimidate or limit the Soviets. The other thing he's talking about here, when he's talking about to reestablish this encirclement, is we know that the Soviets have been invaded a couple times by Germany, both times by Germany. And so what it looks like is the US is creating a circle around Russia of enemies or people that are hostile to Russia and the Soviet Union. And so this is really, Wallace is saying, like, this is going to anger Russia, and maybe rightfully so, that you were putting all of these hostile people around them. And you keep saying that you're trying to spread democracy, but have you stopped to think about perhaps these places don't want democracy? They haven't asked for these things. And I'll just kind of point something out. I don't know if you remember, it's been a long time, but I've shown you a couple cartoons or things about pushing democracy or freedom in places or using that as justification. And so we talked about that with the United States taking over the Philippines or forcing the Filipinos to accept American rule in anticipation of their democracy. So I showed you an interesting cartoon with Uncle Sam pointing a bayonet at the Philippines and essentially trying to force freedom and things on them, which is essentially kind of what Wallace is saying in this as well. All right, so there's a set of documents that I really love. I'm not going to make you do, but they're kind of talking about like who started the Cold War. If we have this fight for world domination that's going to take over, is there somebody who actually started that? And we can kind of see that confrontation in the way that they talk about each other. So if we think about ways that the United States is going to describe the Soviet Union, they're going to say the Soviet Union is trying to expand their power, trying to control other places and the outcomes of elections. They're trying to suppress what the people want or any sort of opposition to the Soviet Union. And they are violating people's rights and their desires. So look at how terrible the Soviet Union is. But then when the US talks about themselves, they're going to be like, look at, we are supporters of free nations, of democracy. We're a world leader. We're the world police. We're protecting people. And look, we're providing resources for the world. Essentially, look how awesome we are. We're doing a good deed for the world. But then when the Soviet Union describes the United States, or critics like Wallace are going to describe the United States, they're going to use words that are essentially the same. Look, the United States is trying to expand their sphere of influence and their control in the world. Okay, they're going to try and control the outcome of elections, trying to control what sort of ideology that people follow around the world. So it's not really what these people want or these nations want, it's what is in the interest of the United States. So suppressing people's desires. And the same thing, they're going to violate people's rights and desires because America's more interested in what benefits them rather than the desires of a nation. And I point this out because essentially what we're going to see is the Soviet Union and the United States are two sides to the same coin. Both are trying to increase their power and spread their ideology around the post-war world. Okay, so again, this is the same as this. They're both trying to expand their ideology and their power, okay, their sphere of influence. Yes, one is talking about democracy and one is talking about communism, but really it's about power. It's not about those ideologies. They're less concerned about whether a nation follows communism or follows democracy as long as it is under their influence and they can kind of control the outcome. And the way I really think about this is, look, US, United States, US, Soviet Union, SU. You flip those over, they're the same thing. And again, I'm not saying that the Soviet Union is a great place. Like Stalin is an evil dictator that is going to lead to millions and millions of people dying. But what I do want to make sure that is very clear is that both of these superpowers want to have world domination. And they want to be in control of the world. All right. So, perhaps I should have done this a little bit earlier, but that's okay. As we kind of start talking about what does the Cold War mean for the domestic United States, it's kind of important or good to think about, what is it that the United States values or that our goals might be in the United States. And I love this speech from FDR, and he's giving it in 1944, so we're going back a little bit, in his State of the Union. And this is towards the end of World War II, and he's already thinking about what does a post-world or post-war world look like. And so he's kind of laying out his Bill of Rights, so his second Bill of Rights, or his economic Bill of Rights for the United States. And again, he's still in the middle of fighting a war, but he's thinking about what is the world going to look like after that. Okay. All right. So I'm going to skip down here, and these are the 10 or 8 things that he talks about that all Americans should have. And what I want us to think about, this is in the way, is do we live up to these things? Do we live up to these things in the beginning of the Cold War, and do we live up to them today? Would FDR be happy with our progress? Do we do these things? Okay, so number 1, he wants people to have the right to a useful and financial rewarding job. Okay, are they making enough money to make it worthwhile to take care of their families? All right, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. So do people have their basic needs met? And do they have a little bit extra? So can they go to the movies? Can they go on vacation? Or are they working 24/7? We might think that this is a luxury, but sometimes this is really necessary. All right, so the right of farmers to sell his products at a return, which will give him and his family a decent living. So essentially these things, but for farmers. The right of every businessman to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and dominion by monopolies at home and abroad. So that there are fair trading practice, that they can compete essentially and make money. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate Medicare. Again, a really big thing that we're talking about right now. Do people have access to medical care? Can they go get a test? Can they stay home? Can they take care of their loved ones and enjoy good health? The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. Good education, and that these should spell security. That essentially, once we have these, our goals should be human happiness and well-being, that all of our citizens are taken care of, and that they have these basic needs met. So I would say just pause for a second and really think about for yourself, have we lived up to these things? You guys probably remember that I am a pessimist, and I tend to look at things as a glass is half empty. And so when I look at this list, I don't think that we did a very good job living up to these. I think we could make some arguments about good education. Maybe we do know that the crisis right now that we're in is showing us how inadequate or unequal our education is. And the other thing is this one, maybe we say we have this to some degree. You remember that we take care of people, or people have access to Social Security. It kind of helps them through some of these things. But again, if we're thinking about the crisis that we're in right now, it might point out that we have not done a great job of providing these things for people. And then we might ask ourselves, well, why is it? Why did we not do these things for people? And we're going to kind of talk about that. All right, so this is a magazine, or magazine cover from 1948. And I love this because you have this couple right here, and they are clearly not on the same page. You can tell they're having an argument. And I just love that she's not going to give. She's going to pout and look at him, but she's not giving in, even though he's like screaming at her. This poor child down here. But you can see he's pointing to somebody, and she's got somebody on her newspaper. So they are arguing about the election in 1948. All right. So we are going to see that Truman, here he is right here. And let me move my picture because this is a pretty epic picture. Truman is going to win that election in 1948 that we see in the last slide. And I love this because at this moment, he is really, really unpopular. So much so that the newspapers are going to print that he lost. They are like, meh, Dewey's going to win. Truman's out of it. We're just going to print our newspapers early, call it a day. But Truman's smiling here, and that's because the newspapers got it wrong, and he actually won. All right, so Truman's going to be in charge post-World War II, and it's his job to essentially take us from wartime to a peacetime, try to heal some of that and kind of get us going again. And Truman, I think, has lots of flaws, but I think he does some pretty important, big things too. And one of those is he's going to sign this executive order 9981, which is going to desegregate the armed forces. We had desegregated the defense industry in World War II, but he's going to go a step farther. I think this is a pretty big one. It's really important, but also it shows his growth. If you read some of his earlier work, he is pretty dang racist. And he kind of changes his tune, particularly as president. He starts to say, hey, look how hard African Americans and other minorities worked in World War II. Perhaps I was wrong. And so he's going to be the first president to give a civil rights message to Congress and to speak to the NAACP. And you really see his growth as a human in some of these early actions. But he has a really challenging job when he's in office. He's going to fill FDR's shoes. He's not very educated, and taking a country from a wartime to a peacetime is really, really hard, particularly if you're trying to fill FDR's shoes, who helped the country again through the Great Depression and World War II. He's also going to be the president in the beginning of the Red Scare, and that is not a fun job. So because he's doing this really difficult thing, we're going to see by 1946, not everybody is a Truman fan. He's dealing with some really big problems, including that the Republicans are going to take control of Congress. And so they're going to become the majority, which is going to make it even harder for him to get things done, which is why people predict that he is going to win the presidential election. Okay, but he doesn't. But what he does do is come up with this idea of the fair deal. So FDR had the New Deal in World War II, but Truman's going to have the fair deal. And it's his plan to essentially make this right here a reality, to make this second Bill of Rights, FDR's Bill of Rights, Economic Bill of Rights, a reality. And so he wants to do things like give people health insurance, fund education, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, he is not very successful at this. People are going to be like, oh, no, that sounds like communism. Oh, no, that sounds like socialized medicine. And there's going to be some really strong organizers who fight back against these ideas. And again, they're kind of using the rhetoric of communism to say, oh, no, we don't want to do these things right now. Okay? And I think it would be really hard to beat Truman. He's dealing with a lot of issues. So some of these we've already talked about, but one that I don't think can be overlooked is economic anxiety. And if you remember back to World War I or post-World War I, we're going to see major issues as soldiers return from World War I, that there are too many people and not enough jobs. And we talked about that with the race riots in Chicago. But Truman and Congress do a really good job of making sure that that doesn't happen again, to make sure that there are some resources that are put into place for veterans and to help the country transition from that wartime to that peacetime. But there's a lot of anxiety in the United States, economic anxiety, but also couple that with the threat of communism. And he needs to appear, or feels that he needs to appear, tough against communism. However, changes aren't just happening in the United States. We're also seeing that around the world. And so one of the areas you see that is through the creations of the UN. So UN is essentially the League of Nations 2.0, right? And their goal is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirming faith in human rights. So promoting international cooperation and serving common interests of members. Essentially, how do we prevent a world war from ever happening again? Okay. And so one of the big things that falls under that is human rights. Okay. And these are rights that we should all have just because we are human. And this is one of the journal entries that you are going to do for me. So really pay attention to that list. What are those things that we have as a result of this human rights list? All right. So if we look at that list, there's like 30 of these rights. And we can actually divide that into civil and political rights and economic and social rights. And this is actually very, very important because there are 30 rights. There is no country in the world at that time or this time that provides all of those rights. There's also no way for the UN to enforce what those rights are. So nations focus on certain ones of them. And so in the United States, we focus on civil and political rights. So things like freedom from slavery, discrimination, torture. We could argue about how successful we are at these things. Equal protection under law, freedom of movement, suffrage, or the right to vote, freedom of thought, opinion, expression, association, and religion. Okay, so these are the ones that we supposedly focus on. But another set of those are social and economic rights. So free basic education, social security, employment, fair wages, and equal pay for equal work, an adequate standard of living that includes food, clothing, housing. Okay. To guess, who do you think focuses on these? If you guessed the Soviet Union, you would be right. So what we see is that we are going to attack the Soviet Union for not providing rights like this, and the Soviet Union is going to attack us for things like that we don't do enough of these things. Really, neither one of them are living up to their full commitment of protecting human rights. So I'll give you an example. In the United States, we supposedly have freedom of thought, freedom of expression. We think that that's a pretty dang important one. And so we're going to criticize the Soviet Union for not allowing that. Oh, you don't let your people criticize you. You make journalists disappear if they criticize what your country is doing, etc., etc. But on the other side, the Soviet Union is going to be like, look at all the homeless people you have. Look at all your people who don't have access to healthcare. Look at all of your racism in the United States. You guys are terrible. We provide those things. I mean, we could talk about that there aren't a lot of Black people living in the Soviet Union, but we'll save that one for another day. But essentially, they're going to go back and forth at each other for not providing rights, or the rights that they think are a priority in the other place. And so to just kind of give you a silly way of looking at that, I have this meme for you right here. It says, Americans, basic human rights. Is this communism? Because again, these are going to be the ones that places like the Soviet Union focuses on. They are a communist nation, but in reality, these are all human rights. These are all things that the UN says that we as human beings should have. It's a strange world we live in. Let's see. Do I want to keep going? All right. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how much I want to do with you guys today. All right, we're going to do just a tiny bit more and then I'll be done. All right. So the Red Scare, I'm sorry, getting ahead of myself. So the Cold War is going to keep going. One of the years that's really important is 1949. The reason that 1949 is super important is because, number one, the Soviet Union is going to detonate their own atomic bomb, and communists are going to gain control of China. So again, the Soviet Union is going to detonate their first atomic bomb. So this is very scary for Americans because oh my gosh, the Soviet Union has the same weaponry or power that we have. The other thing is we're going to get communist China. So Chiang Kai-shek, which is this guy right here, which you can't see because my face is in the way. This is Chiang Kai-shek. He is going to be part of the nationalist government. And he and Mao Zedong, or the communist leader, had been fighting prior to World War II. They're going to put that on hold for World War II, and then they're going to start fighting after. Again, he's not doing so well. He's not doing well, and so he's going to flee to Taiwan, which I'll show you in just a second. Okay, and he's going to say that he is the true leader of China, the Republic of China, from Taiwan. We are going to stay loyal and back this government until the 1970s. Okay. However, he is a terribly corrupt leader. He's going to take over the island of Taiwan, and he is going to essentially execute or jail anybody who opposes him. Something called the era of the White Terror. Okay. However, Mao Zedong and his people, or his government, the People's Republic of China, are going to take over mainland China. He's going to be in control. Okay, he's going to maintain control of China until his death, and then somebody else in the Communist Party will take over. Okay, but I'm going to show you how ridiculous this is. All right, so this is all mainland China. This is Taiwan. We, as the United States, back the guy who fled to this tiny island, who took over this island that was not empty, was full of Taiwanese people, and said that he is the true leader of all of this. Okay, maybe we don't like Mao, maybe we don't like communism, but let's be realistic, guys. Okay? But anyways, when that happens, this is really scary for Americans because there are now more people, population-wise, that fall under communist control than under a democratic government. So not only do the communists have a Soviet weapon, but the communists also outnumber us, which is pretty crazy. All right, the last thing I'm going to show you, and then I'll be done for the day, is this. So these are some silly pictures. Yes, this is Miss Dietrich. The reason I know a lot about this is I was an exchange student in Taiwan. And so these are the pictures of 18-year-old Miss Dietrich wandering around. And this is Chiang Kai-shek's memorial. So this is the memorial, all these things, to this guy right here. Okay. And so as an evil dictator that's going to take over, he gets to decide what his memorial looks like and how big it is and how people are going to celebrate. And so that's what you're looking at. This had been a prior leader of Taiwan. And again, Miss Dietrich should probably not be climbing on statues, but 18-year-old Miss Dietrich did not like to follow rules. I normally tell really ridiculous stories about my time or my experience here, which I'm not going to do in this lecture. But if you want to ask me questions when we have our Zoom meetup, you're more than welcome to. I promise you, I have some ridiculous stories. But I think that I've talked to you enough today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this lecture right here. Please make sure you're working on your journals. Again, let me know if you have any questions.